What's up everybody, Biletsky here, and today we're going to go over the core rules changes in the new FAQ and Errata for 2021. We're going to start with the FAQ, then go to the Errata, and we're just going to highlight the core rules changes, so things that are pretty general and not faction specific. That'll be its own video. If you like my content, or especially if it helps you out to understand the game better, please like and subscribe, it really means a lot. And having said that, let's just get right into it. So FAQ change number 1. Abilities that may be used, but are not, don't count towards their once per limit. This matters for effects like Chronicle Geomancy, where you can discard a card to create a geode marker, but you don't have to. So if you heal, you don't have to trigger it, and then if you heal later during the same activation, you can still do it because you didn't do it the first time. However, if the effect isn't a May, like Sovereign's AoE after moving, it does trigger on the first time, even if there's no enemies nearby. Number 2 is a new clarification on the Another controversy. For those that aren't familiar, Another used to be a big point of contention in the community because things like Ricochet didn't work properly with the way it was defined before. The rules as written used to define Another in Ricochet as the user, meaning that you could just ricochet onto the target and get double damage, which isn't how it's supposed to work. The new definition for Another is going to be everything other than the most recent noun in the text that fits within the restrictions applied. A good example of this is the corrupted Ley Lines definition. Friendly controlled models with a lodestone token, or within 1 inch of a friendly model with a lodestone token, may take the interact action to move that lodestone token to another friendly model within 6 inches and line of sight. So the most recent noun before Another that still applies under the definition of friendly model would be the friendly model with the lodestone token. Therefore, a model with the lodestone token or a friendly model near the lodestone token can take the interact action to move the lodestone token to any model other than the friendly model that is currently carrying the lodestone. Moving on to number 3, we have obey effects to walk or otherwise move count as a model moving itself, so it's not prevented by things like staggered if it's a friendly, or planted roots if it's an enemy. And that's pretty straightforward. Number 4, if a condition is removed mid-activation, any actions used are sort of retroactively redefined. So, for instance, if Shrug Off, which is a bonus action, removes the stunned condition, that retroactively makes Shrug Off not count towards your activation limit this activation. Number 5 is just a clarification on what an interrupted push is. It's pretty straightforward. Number 6, effects that allow targeting with melee actions don't change engagement range, but effects that change the range of the base action do. This is pretty much in line with what we already thought. The territorial trigger on Malosaurus Rex will make your engagement range 3 inches, but something like a Waldgeist doesn't get an engagement range that covers an entire terrain piece. Number 7 is one that I actually didn't expect. The stealth ability will affect the model from which the line of sight for the action is drawn. So for instance, if Nexus is 12 inches away from a target, but is attacking through a model that's only 1 inch away from the target, she can still attack through stealth. Number 8 is a bit of a strange one as well. Anywhere within range needs line of sight unless the object place is itself. So nothing changes about effects like Leap, you can still place anywhere within 6 inches, but for actions like Create Web, the web marker has to be within line of sight. Number 9 is another important clarification. Effects that resolve after the current action or ability will now resolve at the next moment that no action or ability is resolving, not as soon as any action or ability ends. So you can think of it as sort of the queue has to be cleared completely before they resolve. For number 10, we have the Take the Hit ability does not regenerate effects, meaning that once a model is targeted, you generate all the effects that affect that action, and then you don't generate them again if Take the Hit changes the target. So if you take the hit from a terrifying model, the attacker is still going to have to take that terrifying check. However, abilities like Manipulative that specify this model still will only apply to actions that are targeting that specific model. I think most notably this stops the highly maligned Intrepid Emissary take the hit into bribery on Flush with Cash to completely nullify an attack. A lot of people are going to be happy that that's not a thing anymore. Moving on to number 11, hazardous terrain now does not create kill credit even if generated by a model, unlike effects like Catalyst. Personally, I don't really get the distinction on this one. Why does Catalyst kill a model and give kill credit, but, for instance, Field of Steel doesn't, but, well, sometimes it's just like that. Number 12. Effects that make models ignored by strategies and schemes do not transfer the lodestone. This is a really strange case, but I suppose it can happen. So if your model becomes ignored by strategies and schemes while carrying the lodestone doesn't go anywhere, it just can't do anything until it moves to another model. Number 13 is a very general scheme clarification. Strategy markers count for any scheme that requires markers. So it used to be that research missions had to specify including strategy markers. It doesn't have to do that because you can always specify strategy markers for any of those types of schemes. Number 14, the face in the crowd ability does not count the model itself. That's just a typo, and we pretty much could already guess that's not how it was supposed to work anyway. Number 15, Burger King foot lettuce. Hanged versus hanged and jokers. When I first read this one, I was really confused, but I kind of get it now. All that this specifies is that when resolving effects at the start of a duel, or I guess also during a duel, the attacker's effects apply first and then to defenders. I was initially confused because I was thinking, why don't the hanged abilities just cancel each other out? But that's not the purpose of this ruling. The purpose is to make sure that any two abilities that might conflict with one another now have a specified order, attacker and then defender. So it equally applies to situations like if an Ungentlemanly Affairs model were to attack a model with Luck Thief. First, the Ungentlemanly Affairs would turn all the negatives into positives, and then the Luck Thief ability would turn all the positives back into negatives. For number 16, we have a clarification on triggers that cause actions. In this case, if an action allows a model to take another action, but has a trigger that changes what type of action the second action is, the ruling that you cannot declare triggers from actions that resulted from triggers still applies. And last but not least, for number 17, we have ignoring terrain and ignoring vertical distance. These you can pretty much just read off the text. They're very straightforward, and it's pretty much stuff we already knew. Moving on to the errata now, we're going to start to go in increasing order of importance, starting with the little stuff. So at number 6, we have a clarification on blast and shockwave markers being removed, that it doesn't trigger abilities and effects. Over to number 5, additional masters now have to be declared before crew select. This is an interesting compromise to the secondary master mechanic. I know that a lot of tournaments don't allow it at all, but this, alongside fixing some of the problems with some masters being too strong, we'll see if this evens the playing ground and allows secondary masters to be more widely accepted. It's pretty tricky declaring a second master now, considering that your opponent basically knows what 1/3 of your crew will be. Moving up to number 4, hazardous terrain now counts when in base contact in addition to when inside it. I think this matters most with geode markers and grave goo in the seeker keyword, but it could have other applications that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. Now we get into the big changes. Number 3, we have summon tokens. Summon models without summon upgrades can no longer cheat their way into non-summon status for schemes, actions, or triggers. In particular, the exorcism trigger will now work on all of these different models that you can summon without summon upgrades. In addition, summon models don't count for friendly schemes and strategies on the turn that they're summoned, not just that they can't take the interact action. Part of me felt like this was already a thing, but I think it's actually new. Anyway, this makes a big change into really leveling the playing field along all summon masters. No longer do we have some of them that are summoning with upgrades and have all of these weaknesses, and then others that just get to summon for free and it doesn't even count as a summoned model. In addition, there's a change to summon models in the Gaining Grounds 2-pack which almost slipped by unnoticed. Summon models cannot interact with strategy markers for any reason for the rest of the game after they're summoned. So you can still use summon models to score any scheme you want, as long as it's been at least a turn since they were summoned, but they can't help you in Symbols of Authority, Turf War, or Break the Line directly at all. I think this was an extremely elegant way of toning down the summoning keywords. The ability for masters to summon their scheme runners is definitely not removed completely, but does now have a significant restriction on it that lets non-summon crews compete more fairly with summoning crews. Most importantly, without a series of clunky changes to every single summoning crew. I genuinely really like this change. Number 2, we have the toward and away push directions. They have a lot of wiggle room now. Now instead of pushing along the line center to center between two models or markers, You can choose a point anywhere on the base. At first it might seem like this just gives you kind of a wiggle room cone that you can push models in, but depending on how close they are and how big each base is, you could actually push them almost 90 degrees off to the side. And if they're in base contact, you can actually choose the point that are right next to each other where the bases are touching and actually push 90 degrees to the side. This is a massive buff to pushes away and a pretty big buff to pushes toward as well. In addition, for lure effects now, you can't move away at any point in the move, even if this would eventually bring you closer. So whereas before you might have to move something like this, now you would just move directly toward the model and bump against the obstacle in the way. And finally, we have the #1 biggest change to all of Malifaux in this new errata and FAQ, and you probably already know what it is. Focused and Distracted now cancel, and Focused maxes at +2. This has the potential to be a huge meta shift. Now, whereas before, Distracted was usually beaten out by Focused, as in if your model is distracted, you could just concentrate or get focused another way, and then you could still cheat your duel like normal and get a plus flip on the damage. Now instead of Focused being the solution to Distracted, Distracted is the solution to Focused. If a model with a really scary severe damage has Focused on it or can get it by concentrating, putting Distracted on that model will make it nearly impossible to hit attacks by normal means. Especially for big beat sticks, if you put some Distracted on them, they don't have the time to really wait around and collect Focused to get rid of the Distracted. They really want to be attacking, so that's a huge detriment to their game plan. This also might be a buff to small models, because the assist action is now really good for getting rid of Distracted, especially against certain keywords. And finally, you can never stack Focused higher than +2 now. So crazy stacking of Focused up to +3 or +4 with things like Georgian Olaf or Mr. Nataro isn't going to be as crazy. They can get up to +2, but they're going to have to do something else with actions until they can at least use one of them. Overall, I think this is going to be a very healthy change for the game. It takes down a notch some of the most powerful tactics, like putting Focused on something with 6 severe damage and then one-shotting enemies, and it gives really cheap models a reason to be taken. Up until now, a lot of the models in the 3, 4, and 5 cost range are very rarely hired. There is a slight danger of the Distracted condition now being too strong and being too much of a buff for certain crews, but for the time being, I think it's a good fresh mix-up, and it's going to jumble up some of the power values between all the crews. And with that being said, that's more or less the FAQ in Errata, at least the general portion. Stay tuned for the faction-specific video that's going to go over all the buffs and nerfs, as well as some of the FAQ questions about more faction-specific topics. And also stay tuned for my review of the new Gaining Ground 2 player pack and all the strategies and schemes. Let me know in the comments below if you disagree with any of my interpretations, or if you just want to give me a shout out. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you next time.